Welcome to Rome. Now, I hear that you want to learn Latin, but you're not sure if you want to learn Ecclesiastical Latin or Classical Latin. I'm here to tell you that, of course, the only obvious choice is Ecclesiastical Latin.
Whoa, are you crazy, pal? Everybody knows that Classical Latin is way better, and the only true Latin there is.
Who the devil are you and what are you doing here?
I'm here to tell you, and all yous out there, that obviously you should learn Classical Latin.
Are you challenging me to a debate?
You know it, Mr. Hoity-toity wax whiskers.
I accept you. Who are you exactly?
I'm a class act is who I am. Now as for you, Mr. Cleasy, can I call you Cleese? Because you remind me a bit of John Cleese.
You may not. Class act. Street class, more like.
You know it, bro. Streets of Rome, am I right? Can I get a new ra in the Subu ra?
What an embarrassing fellow.
Ha! You know what's embarrassing? Ecclesiastical Latin. Yeah, you heard me. All that vulgar medieval garbage. Half romance, half sanctimonious hocus pocus. That ain't real Latin. The only real Latin is Classical Latin.
My dear fellow, you seem to be misinformed.
Oh, really? Do tell, Mr. Cleasy.
If you mean to refer to Latin literature, the Latin of the Church has at all times been the same as the Latin of the academics. The only thing that makes Latin ecclesiastical is if the clergy or the Church were involved somehow, as ecclesia is Latin for church, from the ancient Greek ecclesia, meaning assembly.
Really? You mean that medieval Latin ain't the same as ecclesiastical Latin?
Only if the Latin was composed by members of the Church. To quote mid-20th century Jesuit and philologist Emilio Springhetti in his Institutiones Stili Latini, Latinitas ecclesiastica creditur esse, quae oritur ex mixtionin condidas sermonis Latini vulgaris et Christiani, ex vocibus barbaris medievi usurpatis, dissoluta et inornata. Sed Latinitas, quae vero nomine ecclesiastica dicitur, il est, qua utitur ecclesia, pura, perspicua, elegans, qualis aureo saeculo Latinitatis firma legibus viguit. Non anim ecclesiae causa et rerum sacrarum dignitas leditur elegantia sermonis, sed ornatur.
Well, for real? So, ecclesiastical Latin isn't just bad Latin?
No, not at all. Latin, spoken or written by the Church, if it be worthy of the name, follows all the norms of Standard Latin, a term virtually synonymous with Classical Latin.
Well, what about late Latin, like the Vulgate Bible? There's some weird grammar in there, like scimus quia verum est, instead of the proper accusative plus infinitive, scimus verum esse.
Late Latin differs from Classical Latin in a few ways, it is true, both in grammar and vocabulary. However, other than the quotations we make of that text, we do not compose new texts in the style of late Latin. Like you in your academic circles, we use standard Classical Latin as our basis.
So the same classical authors that I revere from the 1st century BC to the 2nd century AD, they are your models too?
That is correct. If one should wish to pursue the Latin of the Church, one need only study textbook Latin that one could find in any course on the subject. It's all simply Latin.
And if you want to learn Latin, then my course on story learning may be for you. I've written an original Latin novella about a daring archaeologist, a genius physicist, and a tremulous philologist. 21st century explorers and fluent Latin speakers on a quest for a lost relic from the Roman Empire. This novella forms the core of my course on story learning called Latin Uncovered. Uncovered because of archaeology, right? Get it? An exciting adventure that immerses you in the idiom of modern-day Latin speakers with a mystery that'll keep you guessing till the very end. Now, there are a lot of ways to learn Latin out there, and you know I espouse a lot of them. So whom is this course for, and what makes it different? Well, you can learn with a teacher in a classroom, or you might prefer to just study solo. My story learning course gives you the best of both worlds. You get hours of video instruction from me, how the grammar works, all about the vocabulary, how to conjugate verbs, decline nouns, all of that, as well as the most detailed pronunciation guide I've ever put together so far, all the things that you would get in the classroom, but you don't have to schedule with a teacher or other students. Thus you get the excitement and personal adventure of learning the language on your own, but you have all of the video lessons to guide you along the way. Now as for the novella, It's not a graded reader, and it's like that largely by design. I want to challenge each one of you that gets Latin Uncovered with a real adventure story right from the very first sentence. Nevertheless, every chapter has detailed explanations of the grammar and the vocabulary, plus a full English translation for each chapter, so you're never going to get lost. And naturally, the audio of the story is in both classical and ecclesiastical pronunciation, so you can choose which one you want to learn. So sign up for my story learning course, Latin Uncovered, at the link in the description, and for a limited time, 33% off for all of my subscribers. Now, back to the debate. All right, Mr. Ecclesi, you convinced me that at least written Ecclesiastical Latin is the same as any old Latin. It's just Latin. But that does not change the fact that you sound ridiculous when you talk.
How dare you?
Oh, how do I dare? Like this. Bada bing, bada bang, bada boom. In your face.
Very amusing.
Hey, what are you laughing at? Oh, are you laughing at me? What's so funny? Tell me what's so funny. Am I a clown to you? Am I here for your entertainment, pops?
Indeed, you sound ridiculous with your wenny, weedy, weaky.
I sound ridiculous. You sound ridiculous with your v-v-vs all over the place. You sound like my pal Ani over here.
What do I have to do with it?
Hey Ani, say California for me, would you?
California! This is hard.
Well, I simply believe that Ecclesiastical Latin sounds elegant, regal, sonorous. In addition, it sounds like Italian, with the beautiful che and je. Cena vera pergit lentius. I find those sounds most pleasing.
Okay, sure. I'll give you that. Those are very cool sounds. But that's just a subjective preference. And in this case, I am subjectively right, and you are subjectively wrong.
It is, of course, objective fact that the ecclesiastical pronunciation is descended directly from the voice of the common people of the Roman Empire. And the Holy Church and its pronunciation are its rightful heirs.
Objective fact? More like objective baloney.
Hardly. It is a well-known fact that the Catholic Church's universal Roman pronunciation, as it is properly called, is the conserved, received pronunciation of the first Christians, all the way from the early church of the 3rd century Anno Domini. Emilio Springhetti himself attests to this fact in the very same Institutiones Stili Latini.
Pal, have you got your lines crossed? Now, I'm sure your Mr. Spaghetti,
Springhetti,
whatever, was a very erudite fellow. But what you're talking about is just a common myth. For some unfathomable reason, you and other people who like to repeat a non-fact like that, you want to push the pronunciation system you like all the way back to the classical period. For what? Does it, like, give you more authority or something? If you like your pronunciation convention so much, can't you be satisfied that it sounds good to you and not insist it has to be as old as or nearly as old as the classical pronunciation?
What poppycock? The monstrosity that you call classical pronunciation is nothing more than the invention of a 15th century German, Erasmus.
Dutch, you bozo! His name is Desiderius Erasmus Roterodamus, as in from Rotterdam?
Yes. Your Erasmian pronunciation is merely an excuse for pronouncing badly in an Anglo-Germanic fashion, since you are clearly incapable of pronouncing correctly, as they do here in Italy.
Whoa, you're way off base, buddy. Erasmus probably sounded more like my buddy Ani over here.
That may be an accurate assessment.
In fact, Erasmus didn't grow up using the restored classical pronunciation. He probably used a pronunciation a lot more like yours. But while you use the traditional Italian pronunciation, he would have used the traditional German-Dutch pronunciation of Latin. And that's a pronunciation that's still used a lot in Central and Eastern European countries today.
I don't follow.
Allow me to enlighten your waxness. We actually know extremely well what the pronunciation of Latin was like in the classical period.
How could you possibly know that? Did you find a tape recorder in the ruins buried at Pompeii?
Oh, ha, very funny, Cleese. Well, here's another fact nugget for you. Ever hear a guy named Julius Caesar? Yeah, bet you have, because we got statues of that guy all over town. We even know what he looked like. and we don't need to have film reels of him driving up his triumph on the Via Sacra, do we? And we know he existed thanks to a little something called the historical record. And speaking of Rome, have you ever seen those beautiful reconstructions of the ancient city with all the buildings and the fora and the columns, all that stuff? We know what it looked like, and how do we know that? The historical record. And also, we got whole bunches of the buildings, their remains are still around. Now this is exactly comparable to how we can look at Romance languages today, like Italian, Spanish, you name it. We look at them and we can understand, oh wait, hey, if we take these languages back in time according to linguistic theory, then we're going to get a language that, guess what, sounds like classical Latin. So, good sir, given that we both revere the classical authors, isn't it better to appreciate their works in the pronunciation they actually used?
Great scholars have appreciated the classical authors in the ecclesiastical pronunciation for a very long time. Native English speakers study Shakespeare in the local pronunciation, whether it be British or American, Australian, what have you, and they don't bother to reconstruct the pronunciation of Shakespeare of the 16th century. That would be ludicrous. You wouldn't actually do that.
I actually would, and do. Using 20th or 21st century English pronunciation for Shakespeare, it obscures rhymes and rhythms, whole jokes, important statements. You can't get any of them.
That hardly seems sufficient reason to completely and utterly change one's way of interacting with the text.
Buddy, if raisins were as plentiful as blackberries, I would give no man a raisin upon compulsion. Oh, and by the way, that's why I like to say what.
What?
What? Exactly.
Exactly what?
Yeah, you get it. Now, the other thing I gotta correct you on here, Mr. Ecclesi, is your idea that the late Latin pronunciation is somehow the origin of your ecclesiastical pronunciation. Well, I got news for you, buddy. It ain't.
I'm listening.
Well, for one, we've already reconstructed the sound of late Latin. Roger Wright did that back in the 70s. And guess what? It probably would sound a lot more like Italian today than your ecclesiastical pronunciation does. Final consonants would be silent, all kinds of assimilations would be going on, intervocalic B would be merged with V.
For example?
For example, I say habebat, and you say abebat, because H's are silent in ecclesiastical pronunciation. Now, in late Latin, the time period that you are claiming as the source of your ecclesiastical pronunciation, all the intervocalic B's, that is the letter B between vowels, had merged with the V. Now that means if you were actually using a pronunciation that was native to Latin speakers at that time, you would be saying now in ecclesiastical pronunciation avevat instead of abebat. It sounds just like the Italian, aveva.
That's only one letter. Can't you name another?
As a matter of fact, I can. Even in the classical period, the final M was not a true consonant. You don't pronounce that in front of vowels, you nasalize the preceding vowel.
Oh yes, that silly thing you do to make you sound like a Portuguese.
Meaning every time you pronounce a final M in front of a vowel, you are wrong.
De gustibus non disputandum est.
I got another one for you. Amicus, that's the word for a male friend in Latin. Well, what's the plural? Well, the plural is amici in classical pronunciation, and it's amici in ecclesiastical. Sounds just like Italian plural for friends. But take the word for female friend, amica. What's the plural? In classical, amicae. In ecclesiastical, amice. Well, that's weird. Palatalization, who ordered that? In Italian, it's amiche, not amice. There's an actual Latin, Italian, that demonstrates the natural evolution from late Latin into a modern language. So how come you're pronouncing amice instead of amiche? Because what you're using is just a spelling pronunciation. For this and a dozen other reasons, we can see that the pronunciation of Italy, that's called pronuncia scolastica, well, that's just a spelling pronunciation and nothing more. It has nothing to do with the natural development of Latin into Romance languages.
Oh, really? Then where did the ecclesiastical pronunciation come from?
3 words, Pally. Charlemagne. Back in Charlemagne's day, from the Iberian Peninsula to the Italic Peninsula, people, they all said, I speak Latin. That's what they would say. But in reality, from our perspective, we would say they were speaking Proto-Portuguese, Proto-Spanish, Proto-French, Proto-Italian. And anyone that got to go to school and learn written Latin, well, they would learn the formal written language that we call Latin, and they would also learn how to speak it. But they would pronounce this written language according to the normal rules of the native phonology in these Proto-Romance languages. And that means whenever they got together, they had a harder and harder time understanding each other as the centuries went on. So by the late 8th century, it was almost impossible for someone speaking in the Frenchy way to understand someone who was speaking in the Portuguese way. They would pronounce it just like the native phonology, right? So intervocalic B would be a V like we were talking about. They wouldn't pronounce final consonants. It would sound a lot like Romance languages. They would just write it with Latin orthography. It's a lot like what people do in English today, using an orthography that's better suited to Middle English than to modern English phonology.
Go on.
So even proper Latin speakers in the late 8th century, they couldn't understand each other anymore if they came from Portugal or Italy or these different places because their accents were too different. So Charlemagne got this guy, Alcuin, an Englishman, who had excellent Latin pronunciation, as Englishmen had back in that day, according to some ancient authors. And so he asked this guy, Alcuin, can you please standardize this mess over here, because we don't know what we're doing. And Alcuin said, you got it, Charlemagne. This will be done in an instant. You know what he did? He made a spelling pronunciation system, one sound per letter. And the result probably was something that sounded a lot like the classical pronunciation, or the ecclesiastical pronunciation, or maybe something in between. We don't know. So this pronunciation system is spread all over Europe. And the consequence was that all those people before that were saying they speak Latin, well, now they go and they hear the church guy talking Latin. They can't understand him anymore because he's pronouncing every letter like, well, that's not how I talk. So that creates the real break between Latin and living Romance languages. That's the day that Latin died and became an immortal language.
Go on.
But something else changed. This standard, restored, semi-classical pronunciation that is the origin of your ecclesiastical pronunciation, well, all the languages in Europe keep changing. And naturally, they want to pronounce the Latin letters pretty much like they pronounce them in their normal languages, whether that be German or French or Spanish or Italian. So here's an example. We got, in my pronunciation, classical, we got gena gemmaque, right? Well, up until the 19th century, how they pronounce that in Spain? Cena gemaque. Well, what about in France? Cena gemaque. In Germany, cena gemaque. And of course, in Italy, cena gemaque.
So, you're telling me?
Yes, the ecclesiastical pronunciation, which we have established is the traditional Italian pronunciation of Latin, is really the pronunciation of an Englishman designated by a Frankish king for a Germanic empire.
That's horrifying.
Oh, don't let it keep you down, please. You'll like the sound of ecclesiastical, right? That's what matters.
I suppose so.
So hey, is this a debate or more of a friendly conversation?
I thought it was more of a Socratic dialogue.
You know, you can get killed for that. I guess that makes me the bear. Well, Mr. Lion, where were we?
The age of ecclesiastical pronunciation, since it does not come from antiquity as I formerly believed. Tell me then, how old is the ecclesiastical pronunciation?
Well, Charlemagne's reforms were at the beginning of the 9th century, but we don't know exactly what Alcuin's pronunciation system was supposed to be. Was it nearly exactly like classical pronunciation, pretty much like we do today? Or was it exactly like ecclesiastical pronunciation? It really could have been either one or something in between. However, we can be certain, around the time that Italian becomes a thing, which is the 14th century roughly, that the ecclesiastical pronunciation is at least that old.
700 years then. Not too bad.
Not too bad at all. However, it wasn't until the 20th century that the Pope actually adopted the scholastic Italian pronunciation as the official Catholic Church pronunciation. Because before they were using the traditional pronunciations, right? But that was already decades after, in the 19th century, that pretty much all of academia, outside of Italy of course, had adopted the classical pronunciation as their standard. So in a way, as a universal standard, Ecclesiastical pronunciation isn't even old as classical pronunciation. But true, in Italy at least, ecclesiastical pronunciation, as it's used here today, is the pronunciation that scholars have used for centuries.
That brings us back to Shakespeare. Haven't millions appreciated Shakespeare's language, but in vernacular contemporary pronunciations, just as millions have appreciated Latin in ecclesiastical pronunciation?
I grant you that, but you are missing the most important part of the Latin literature, and that is the phonemic vowel lengths. In classical pronunciation, all the phonemic vowel lengths, all of that is intact. And that means that I can appreciate all the prose, all the poetry, all the speeches way better than you can.
What? But of course I observe all long and short vowels and long syllables and all that. Otherwise the rhythm would be lost.
You do? How can that be?
Well, I think you know this quite well. The Latin language is fundamentally based on phonemic vowel length. It is, of course, a Moraic language, as you might call it. The difference between rosa and rosa, anus and anus, caro and caro, these are fundamental to the lexicon. Not only that, all of the poetry, all of the prose, all of the literature, the way that they spoke indeed as you claim to reconstruct, that is all in the literature. The morphology, the grammar. Without phonemic vowel length, it would be like pronouncing Italian without the geminated consonants. Unspeakable! Unspeakable, I tell you!
Quanti anni hai, am I right?
What a boorish fellow! But yes, you are right. The difference between cena gemmaque and cena gemmaque is rather minute on the whole, if we have the long and short vowels all correct and the geminated consonants where they belong.
Are you really telling me, though? Well, let's be honest here, Ecclesi. We've known each other for several minutes now. Are you telling me that all ecclesiastical speakers really retain phonemic vowel length like you're saying they should?
Well, no, I can't say that. But nor can you about users of the classical pronunciation who frequently ignore phonemic vowel length, even though they supposedly use the restored, reconstructed pronunciation.
Yeah, that is a shame. If they're not observing phonemic vowel length, then in my opinion, it ain't Latin.
Well, I tend to agree with you. Don't you think that's a bit harsh? Perhaps we could say they're just using a different convention.
Yeah, but I don't like the convention. I think it's lazy and dumb.
Perhaps we can find a more persuasive way of phrasing that, eh?
Yeah, you're probably right. You know, you ain't half bad, Ecclesi.
I also find you to be quite a bit more tolerable than I had anticipated on the whole. I suppose we're not all that different, you and I.
So what do we tell people? Should they learn ecclesiastical pronunciation or classical pronunciation? It's of course important to say that, obviously, ecclesiastical pronunciation and classical pronunciation are completely mutually intelligible. There's very little confusion, very similar to a Brit talking to an American. And you probably agree with me that it's best to learn both pronunciations eventually, whichever one you start with, at least to be able to recite it, in order to appreciate and understand other people that use that other pronunciation, you know? What do you think, Ecclesi?
I suppose it depends where they'll be working or what they'll be doing. If they'll be... Where is it? Over here. If they'll be working with the church in some manner, it's probably best they learn the ecclesiastical pronunciation. I think you can agree. But if they're going to be in academic circles, universities and the like, probably the classical pronunciation might suit them for that sort of company, if you wish to keep it.
Yeah, that's fair. But what if someone has a choice? And if they're just learning on their own?
Well, I suppose it's as you said earlier. It's a subjective preference, is it not? Except that I am subjectively right and you are wrong.
Yeah. In your dreams, pal!
Why I order?
Justa alia est.
Hold still, you half-waxed, whiskered, four-eyed moron!
This means war.
So even proper Latin... So even... Let me relax my mouth. I gotta relax just a little bit. All right, here we go, here we go, here we go. So even proper Latin speakers...
It is of...
Okay, see, you made your point, okay. But they would pronounce it just like the native phonology. Intervocalic B would be merged with V. I would want to destroy those freaking cars. Very important part of the phonology is the indescribable desire to destroy every car.
De gustibus non est dis... De gustibus, mannaggia. De gustibus.
Well, for real? So, Ecclesiastical Latin.
Get on. Cambiano.
Whoa, for real? Hey, I'm working here. Hey, what do you laugh? Oh, ow. Hey. All right. What are you laughing at me? Are you laughing at me?
Sì,
Am I here for your amusement?
sì, non mi uccidere.
Are you laughing at me? Am I here for your